Howdy folks. I made a shield, but the thing is, it's not very good. I don't like it. I made it too big. It's too big and too heavy. So when I was making this was my first curved heater shield I've made. And first of all, I used 2 planks of plywood. That was a mistake. I thought it was necessary to make it stronger for sparring. Honestly, 1 plank would have been fine and perfectly durable enough, especially with the linen that adds hardness and strength. Anyways, other thing is that this is on the bigger end as far as length and width for historical shields. And I wanted a bigger shield because it looks cool and it has good protection, but historically I was looking at the images and honestly most of them are probably about half the size. They're just not that big and they're a lot thinner than this. So anyways, I'm going to show you some videos of how overall I went through the process and made it so that you guys can do it too. Alright, before we actually start making the shield itself, we need to make a rig to set the curve of the shield. So you see I have 2 2x4s as just boards to hold the frame, and I have 2 pieces of wood cut to the desired curve that I'm looking for, and for me, I think with the wood that I have, this is the most curve that I can get without breaking the wood, and I just screwed it in. Obviously it doesn't need to be fancy, just wood screws will do the trick. And once we have this set up, then we can actually start looking at making the shield itself. Here we have our 2 boards that are going to form the core of the shield. We have 2 1/4-inch thick boards. The reason why we are using 2 1/4-inch thick boards instead of 1 bigger board is that anything thicker than this will probably not be able to actually bend and give a curve without breaking. But if we just have 1 board, it's probably not going to be quite strong enough, because this is going to be used for HEMA sparring, which takes a lot more blunt trauma effort than a real shield probably would. So we need to make it a little more bulky than historically would be accurate. So we have the general shape of the shield, you can barely see here, drawn onto it before, but the advice I've gotten is to not fully cut out the full shape of the shield until after we have these 2 boards glued together and put to shape. So let's move on and get it put on, glued together. Alright, now we have our 2 boards with a slight curve. As you can see in the picture, I glued them together and then I clamped them down to this rig. I used boards on either side so that the pressure with the clamps was even, so that didn't risk leaving any particular indent, so that it's a straight curve across the edge. I also took an optional step to use warm water under the inside because this is the worst board, and I wanted to minimize the risk of it cracking and breaking. It just softened up the wood a little bit, but that is optional. The next step, we're just going to cut out the shape of the overall board, and I left that on the outside, as you can see. Just make sure to do that. It's an easy mistake to make as you get caught up in the chaos of maybe putting this together if you're rushing a little bit. So make sure that your tracing is on the outside so you don't have to redraw that. But let's go get it cut out. Now we have our 2 boards. They're glued together and they have their curve. They're set. So now we need to sand all the wood down, all the surface area, to prepare it for the next step, which is to add the covering. Alright, now our boards are sanded down and ready for the next step, which is to apply our covering nice and smooth. But one step I want to point out that I think is important is to sand down our edges at least a little bit so that it's more rounded and less angular. This will make the edge stronger, last longer, be less likely to chip. Now ignore those little nails. That was an emergency step I took to hold the boards together in the gluing process. Well, the next step is to apply our covering, which in this case is linen, and that looks like this. So pretty simple. You cut the linen into shape and you glue it on. The only key I want to point out is that you really need to make sure the glue before you put the linen on is completely and evenly applied. You really don't want to have too much glue so that it's soaking through all the way. You want to soak through a little bit like this, but not too much. And also you want to make sure it covers every little tiny square inch, because if it doesn't, it will probably be a little loose and you'll probably notice it later and be frustrated with yourself that you didn't just make it even all across all the way the first time. So let's get the other side glued down and covered in linen. Well, now we have our linen covering along the front, and the back. Like I said, make sure that you have a nice even coat of glue along the whole surface of the wood before you apply the linen. And when there's any bubbles or any creases or anything, you just pull it nice and tight. Any excess you can always cut off. And in this case, the front, I folded the front layer around the back. It's a little messy, but that's okay. It's in the back, not a big deal. It still functions well. The next step is we're going to put on our padding here. That is where the forearm is going to go, because you don't need the padding, but it certainly will feel a lot nicer than having your forearm against just wood and linen. So I will get that ready in a second. For our padding, we need our linen sheet cut to shape. I sewed the edges just to make it look a little nicer and hold together a little bit better. We have our cotton padding. It's not historical, but it is accessible and cheap. And we have a bunch of tiny little nails that are going to hold it down. To make this the easiest, the way I can think of it, is I'm going to hammer down 3 sides, stuff in all the padding, and then hammer down the last side, and then it'll be good to go. Now we have the padding for our forearm sewn together and nailed down. Next part is the straps for the hand to grab. I'm going to use a simple nut, bolt, and washer to hold it down. Certainly looks maybe more industrial, less medieval, but it is more cheap and more affordable than the historical option, which would be rivets, which is a shame because rivets are honestly more fun in my opinion. But let's get this all attached in together. And there we go, that's how I made this shield. There are better ways to do it, there are more historical ways to do it. I use the resources I have and what skills I have, and it's a learning process. And honestly, I just want to make another shield better next time. Thanks for watching, everybody.